Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hunting for Silver Linings. This is our second conversation today. We were already in Zurich, Switzerland, earlier this morning, and now we are here in the Great Lakes region of the U.S. in Michigan, specifically Grand Rapids. It is Tuesday, January 19, and we are joined with George. Where are you, George? I didn't hear you. Are you still in Atlanta? Technology. Well, last I talked to George, he was in Oklahoma, and then he was going to be in Atlanta. And I just heard he's going to be on his way down to Florida.
Naples, Florida. I apologize. For some reason, Zoom is not responding all the time.
It's okay. You're blazing a trail here on the road. That's great.
Well, I have to be on the road. I mean, I have to be careful. At the same time, there's people that I haven't seen for ages. And to be frank with you, given the fact that everybody is taking care of themselves, this is the best time to travel. I'm contrarian, as you know.
Well, I normally have 3 colds and 5 flus by now, and I've not been sick this season, so it's been fantastic for me. But then back to the introductions, we have Professor Joel Westra here at Calvin University. Thanks so much for taking the time, being generous with your time with us today, and good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for having me this morning.
If you could do us the honor of giving us a little bit of a background. We are just getting into a new season of episodes for Hunting for Silver Linings, where we're getting into being curious and bringing on thought leaders around the world and around the globe. And you are the second professor that we have on. Normally we're sticking with ecosystem builders and innovators and investors, so we're really excited to widen the net. So a little background on you.
Thank you. It's exciting to be part of this series. Great things to talk about. And as you'll see in a moment, as I introduce myself more fully, I've been kind of an in the trenches person in these sorts of ventures and remaking things at the university. At Calvin University here in Grand Rapids, I'm associate professor of political science and department chair of the department. I also direct the pre-law program, which is a co-curricular program we have that we've really built into quite an expansive program, leveraging our connections to alumni attorneys and others around the area. Increasingly over the past several years, though, my role has become more and more administrative. I've been playing a key role in a lot of projects coming out of the provost's office. I spent 1 year playing a role on a study committee on faculty compensation that was looking carefully at really how faculty are compensated and how to really balance concerns externally of the market versus internally with the academic community of the university. Following that, I spent 2 years chairing a faculty workload study, which really looked at how faculty workload is allocated and how that might be allocated more efficiently and more flexibly to allow the university to do a lot more different and creative things that it hadn't done in the past. And then for the past 2 years, I've been chairing an effort to revise and rewrite and relaunch the university's core curriculum. And we'll be launching that this fall. It was about 1.5 years of careful thinking, discussion, and working to get the framework developed and approved. And now we're working very quickly towards implementation this fall for incoming students and for current students. I've also been involved in Calvin's new global campus, particularly helping to work on launching in about 1.5 years, we think, an online Mpa program in public and nonprofit administration.
Busy.
Very busy, yes. I enjoy lots of projects.
So you are in a classic environment where the crisis has a silver lining. The COVID has given the opportunity to accelerate processes, procedures. You look at the human capital of the university and you essentially redefining Calvin itself, right?
Absolutely. And that's why I was so excited to be part of this aptly named Silver Lining series. For some of my colleagues, it's all been too much, too quickly. We're reworking things, we're changing things. Now we've had this pandemic and the knock-on economic effects and so forth. For me, it's all been very exciting because the university was starting to think in a much more creative, entrepreneurial, flexible way already. And recent events have helped to accelerate that in mostly productive ways. of course, we think of silver linings. Silver linings come with clouds, and there's certainly been clouds, but there have been a lot of opportunities to take things that we had on the table, bring them forward more quickly with more urgency, rethink them in broader, more expansive, creative and flexible ways. So overall, I think it's been a good time to rethink higher education in general, and specifically how we deliver that at Calvin University.
As you develop these and have been doing this for the last for some time, how many conversations do you have with student bodies, and how much do they inform that early process?
They inform it a fair bit. It's a difficult challenge. The students bring good ideas. They bring kind of on the ground frontline perspectives. But the other side of that is, of course, because they have that frontline perspective, their focus sometimes tends to be quite narrow in terms of their own experience, their own program, in time frame. So to find that balance is difficult. And what has happened, especially in the curricular projects, is we've tried to have regular consultations with the Student Senate, which is the representative body. But I think more importantly has been to have that Student Senate identify key students that can sit on the committees with us and provide a student perspective. And I think that's been a good balance, because it avoids that kind of the collective action problem that one has of who's going to speak into this and what will they say. We have somebody designated. It's a person who wants to be part of a process. And then that person really is part of the process, not just jumping in and out, and can understand and see the big picture a lot more. And so it's been good for us to have that type of student perspective, particularly in addition to the more general feedback. But the students have also reported at the end, it's been an amazing experience for them, because they don't typically think about higher education as an industry. They think about it as a classroom and faculty and courses and assignments, and to see the other side of it and how that works and where things come from and so forth. It's been another great aspect of education to those particular students. That's the way we've tried to balance it, trying to get those selected and appropriately placed students, along with more general opportunities for student feedback and things that, of course, affect them and will affect them significantly.
Sure. I think having those channels already existing for these initiatives has had to have helped the pivot that was necessary in 2020 to get student buy-in. As George and I have been traveling around the globe virtually talking to different ecosystems, one thing that we're always talking about is talent and talent development, and what universities are playing a role as far as innovation. And some are just have fallen flat on their face, right? And that's not unique to other ecosystems. It's happened here all across the US. I can speak from personal experience with Calvin and having Calvin students as interns at a variety of organizations that I work with. All of these students, many of them international, were really impressed with how the university handled 2020. Can you speak about how that went as far as like mitigating risk?
Absolutely. We back up a moment and pick up on some of your earlier remarks as well. I think if this had hit us 8 or 10 years ago, the story would have been a fair bit different. I think it would have caught us quite flat-footed. Calvin has a long tradition of delivering excellent education. We have really a quite high proportion of international students. About 14% of our students are international, and we draw some very good ones, as you might imagine. But the university wasn't even a university at the time, was still a liberal arts college building in that direction, though not really thinking of itself as building in that direction. And so it tended to be quite traditional, quite path dependent, not as nimble. And with the arrival of our current president, Michael Leroy, he had the virtue of being much more far-sighted, I think, seeing some of the incoming trends in higher education and saying, we need to be prepared, we need to be nimble, we need to be strategic, and let's start making some of these changes, including some of the projects I'd mentioned. And so in that environment, then, it's not as though we planned for a pandemic. It's not as though we were in a specific sense, ready for a pandemic, but in a more general sense, we were. We had been able to change a culture a bit towards flexibility, towards innovation, towards becoming more comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty about how the university would run itself. And so in that sense, those very sudden changes that were required last spring and the more substantive changes required for the current academic year, we're able to proceed much better than they might otherwise have been. Last spring, we had to make a very quick pivot, as much of higher education did, from the traditional in-person classroom model of learning to remote learning. And Calvin, like other universities, was really quite far out in front of that, realizing that this sort of setting of people in classrooms, on campus, in housing, in dining halls, would be very bad for this. And so very quickly saying we need to move immediately towards remote learning. And so over the course really of just over a week, we went from our traditional model to fully online. And what the university did to make that quick transition possible within, again, this more, I think, receptive culture of change and ambiguity, was to close down classes for 2 days, give faculty really a crash course in what does online teaching really look like. Some faculty had experience, some had no experience, and in fact weren't very digital in any way. And so I think there was a range of how able and how enthusiastic faculty were about doing this. But there were two themes that the university emphasized in that transition, which were extremely important. One was the idea of community and learning from each other. And so there was a discussion group set up online. There were meetings set up so that faculty who were more experienced, more adept, more comfortable could meet with those who were less ready and felt less confident in doing so. So that was kind of a decentralized exchange of information, which was very good. And the other was, in addition to emphasizing that role of the faculty community, was the consistent theme that the university stated from the top down, which is we are making a quick and immediate change. And so the point of this and the pressure that we face is to figure out how to manage that change well, not to think about how we might rework our courses entirely if we are planning them to be online from the beginning of the term. So for faculty to figure out what are a couple crucial things you can do to make this sudden shift successful for the remainder of the semester. And those two things worked well together. I think it helped faculty to be more confident in their experimentation and in their shift. And that in turn, with the community that was built, worked quite well, because faculty were sharing things that were working well, were not working well, problems encountered, potential solutions. And then that culminated at the end of the term with some online panel discussions. I was part of one of them, where faculty talked about, in particular, just one practice they had experimented with that had either worked very well or not and required a change. And so we kind of leveraged those things quite well to make the spring work. From there, the message changed, the theme changed, which is to say, now we have a summer ahead of us. We're going to be doing online education in the fall, perhaps not fully, perhaps partially. Regardless, we need to be able to pivot to it at a moment. And so now we want to set the bar higher for the good of our students, for the good of our institution. And so we need to think about how do we plan courses to be ready to be online courses, and to be ready to be online courses for everyone, but also from the beginning to be hybrid, because some students would choose not to be in person, even if they could. Some students, particularly, again, we have a number of international students, would not, and in fact, were not able to join us. And so we had some more intensive training sessions through the summer to get our faculty ready to build on the experiences from the spring and set up for fall. And so that then combined with testing for faculty returning to campus, social distancing in the classrooms, which meant using non-traditional spaces as classrooms to enable that social distancing, and also adjusting the academic calendar to avoid longer breaks where the students would disperse and return, worked quite well. The data were incredible about how few infections we actually had. So it was those sorts of policies, again, combined not just with a strong sense of faculty community, but student community of making this commitment to each other to make it work. And I think Calvin University did well too, up front, emphasizing that we are a community. Let's make this commitment to each other. It's the only way we're going to be able to make this work well.
During that process, there's one last question here, and then George, I'll let you jump in. I imagine like this spirit of innovation and having to change so completely, and having that mindset from the beginning. You did address that some members of the community were a little resistant because maybe that's just not something that was necessarily a skill set they had to have for a couple decades. What was that like on the ground? Was there some celebration of failure? You know, because the typical mindset that I have, that I project on a room full of professors, even virtually, is that we don't like to talk about failure, or that like we don't want to be vulnerable or show that side.
Yes, we typically don't. And I think especially faculty who like to think of themselves as the smartest person in the room, and certainly in a room full of students, not to show any sorts of failures. The pandemic, I think, created an opportunity not just to try and fail, but to acknowledge that failure in a way. Let me back up again and put this in larger context. We talked about, this was an opportunity, I think, to accelerate with some changes that we were already considering. When you say to faculty, and higher education is a very traditional field, when you say to faculty, we think you should make changes because there are pressures to change, to accommodate, faculty tend to say, well, things are working quite well, and I'm not confident this change would work better, and I don't want the failure, especially in a classroom or student environment, of that happening. The pandemic made that safer, and safer not just among the faculty, but between the faculty and the students. The students understood that the faculty were moving towards something different very quickly, and I think most faculty were willing to be quite open with that to students. I think that varied a little bit by faculty personality and how adept faculty were. But especially in the spring, what was very interesting, where that was even more dramatic, were that the average course evaluations were slightly higher than normal. And course evaluations are flawed measures for a lot of reasons, but they do tell us something generally about student satisfaction. And I think part of that was students seeing faculty trying, failing, trying again. So I think this was a great opportunity for faculty to be willing to fail, in a way that could be observed, and become more comfortable with that. And therefore, I think and hope more willing to continue to innovate, to continue to be creative, to continue to find new practices that work quite well.
Thank you, Professor. What I have in mind is to broaden the discussion a little bit, because until now you have been talking about two of the stakeholders of the university, the faculty and the students. Can we broaden a little bit your observations before, during, and after COVID, the first shock, in relation to the other stakeholders, the employees, the non-faculty, the community around you, both the business community, but also the secular community? And then let's talk a little bit about the religious component, which is a very, very key aspect of the university. What are your key points, the takeaway points over the last, let's say, 14 months?
Sure. For the other sorts of communities, the other part of the internal community and the external community, we'll start there. On the internal side of things, one benefit that came out as well is I think a lot of the non-faculty employees of the institution became more visible in some sense as they were throughout society. We came to a realization as a society of how many workers in basic industries, food distribution, and so forth really keep the whole economy going. We had that same sort of realization, I think, a deeper realization as a campus about the many other people on campus who keep everything going, keep the library open, keep places clean and sanitary, keep things moving. And I think Calvin did well there too, in the sense that this sense of community and this commitment to one another was always seen as students, as faculty, as staff. We want to keep this institution going. We want to keep everyone safe. We'll all contribute to that. And I think that helped to bridge a divide that tends to open up fairly naturally between the faculty and the rest of the staff. And so I think fostering, promoting that sense of community and just the more seeing of each other really was a good thing for the campus, as it was for the society overall. As far as the broader community external to the campus and connecting to Calvin, I think it was a good opportunity as well for Calvin University to enhance some of its visibility within the city, within the region. People were looking at data a lot about how the community as a whole was doing with case outbreaks, and looking at institutions of higher education, which ones are open, which ones are closed, how are they handling things, how are their numbers. And I think because our numbers were so good, I think that was really provided enhanced credibility for the university and the community, that this is a place that really takes things seriously, thinks deeply about them, and comes up with effective ways to implement good policies. I think also it opened up more opportunities for other types of connections. Again, as I've said repeatedly, higher education tends to be a rather traditional industry, and we think, especially in terms of our modes of learning of in-person, and those have great advantages and many things that we can't substitute for. But on the other hand, this circumstance opened us up to be more willing to do sorts of things like we're doing today, meeting virtually, bringing in people that otherwise might not be able to come in and make that connection. And so realizing the power of the technology, combined really with the way we are starting to think differently about opportunities for engagement and meeting, has allowed the institution, I think, to make connections more broadly with people beyond the region, but also even within the region, of just easier to make an invitation to connect to a class or to a meeting or something like that. And so I think in all these ways, Calvin's connection, especially to the region, but beyond, has been strengthened. Its credibility has been strengthened. And I think that fits well, but also has been a better way to communicate the religious component of Calvin's mission. Calvin University, as a religious institution, sometimes finds it difficult to communicate well to a broader community just how that mission works. It's not a Catholic institution, and so if people have some idea what Catholic institutions of higher learning are about, it's not an evangelical institution either. And so it's a Reformed institution. It thinks about faith really informing our commitment to transform the world to the better, to serve others. As our motto is to think deeply, act justly, live wholeheartedly. And so sometimes people tended to think about Calvin more in contrast to something rather than understanding it as it is. And so some people thinking it's a religious institution, it must be very traditional, it must be more concerned about teaching Bible or theology than teaching whatever else, professional programs, liberal arts and sciences, and so forth. Other people, I think, said, well, no, it's not that. So maybe it's religious in name only, and it's more about a community of people that kind of feel comfortable hanging out with others, but doesn't really incorporate a religious component either. Not really that either. And I think you can talk, you can try to have the right message, but sometimes the actions really are a better message. And I think the way Calvin really emphasized the idea of serving the campus community, serving the broader community, and doing so in a way that was informed by the science, informed by public health practices, and open to innovations as needed, I think was really a more concrete example of how we think about the relationship between faith and learning and our commitment to community.
Since early 2018, when I was fortunate enough to be a guest lecturer in one of your classes, I have noticed the importance of servant leadership. And it is remarkable how this success story that you have described to us so far, how the turnaround from before COVID to during COVID and after COVID has redefined the university. And I have to congratulate you and your colleagues, because this is absolutely wonderful. Corey and I have been looking at universities and academic institutions around the globe. And as Corey mentioned before, they have been unable to adapt for whatever reasons. However, in your case, in Calvin, I have seen a tremendous amount of product innovation, process innovation, but also the human capital. And this is what you've been describing to us for the best part of this last half hour. So when we look at this process of skill, will, and potential that you've been describing, and the servant leadership, where do you go from here? I mean, you have a success turnaround story. I assume you want to grow. I assume that you're attracting a new cohort of students, both undergrads and graduates, professional, non-professional. Tell us a little bit about what is the opportunity now, having redefined the competitive advantage of Calvin University. What is this advantage now? How sustainable it is, and where will you go with it?
Certainly. So some of the groundwork for the innovations we're making now and the way we're rethinking competitive advantage was already laid in the 1970s. So Calvin had been founded not as a liberal arts college, but in some sense as a professional school, as a school for teachers and ministers. And it built onto that and became primarily a liberal arts college, but never fully. There was always an affiliated seminary. There was always an affiliated education program. By the 1970s, the institution started to say we should think about other types of professional education. And soon after that, we ended up with business, we ended up with engineering. So already then, what was being reflected, which we're really building on more today, is an institution that is fundamentally committed to liberal arts education. All institutions claim that, but it's always been a central part of Calvin's identity. It's never been the only part of Calvin's identity. And so there are tensions of how to do that, but already in the 1970s, the institution was saying we need just to continue to think about how to do that well. To do that well, though, required some of these steps we've taken over the last 10 years that I was talking about. So thinking about how do we think about faculty compensation, perhaps in a more decentralized way, reflecting different types of programs, but still maintaining a coherence and community. How do we think about faculty workload in a way that before had been defined purely in terms of teaching, with everything scaled to teaching, some things offsetting, some things not? How do we think about that more flexibly so that we can have faculty doing more things, doing different things, being part of other things? And then finally, with the new core curriculum, what had happened before was that we had a very robust liberal arts and sciences core that then would have pieces kind of shaved off to accommodate professional programs. So we were giving away some of the coherence of community, and we were making some concessions, I think, of liberal arts education to fit things in. We now have a new core that's unified, that works for everyone. I think it's brought liberal arts and sciences back more prominently across the institution So now we're better equipped than ever to start to think about more graduate and professional programs. As you may know, the university recently announced the launching of a new school of business. It received a significant lead gift for that, and that lead gift really was motivated explicitly by the donor, by Calvin's sense of combining really this sense of servant leadership, commitment to our religious commitment and calling to serve others, our emphasis on liberal arts education, but our willingness then to pull those things into creative and effective ways into professional programs. And so that's led to the launching of the new business school. We're also moving more and more quickly into graduate education, and we're able to do that because we're exploring primarily, though not exclusively, graduate education through an online platform, which allows us then not to be limited by our regional market. So not just people around here, but people around the country and even around the world. The university has a lot of connections globally. Those came historically out of the way it was founded. If you're training teachers and ministers in a religious setting, many of them feel called to go overseas. That created these networks where people are sending their kids to Calvin University from around the world because they want their kids to get this strong liberal arts and sciences and or professional education. So we're now saying we have these connections overseas. We have what we believe is quite a unique and winsome and effective approach to education. Let's bring those together. Let's start reaching markets beyond undergraduates, beyond those who are within the region. And so we're launching more and more graduate and professional programs, which are primarily online. And we're also able then not only to use online education to reach new audiences, but also to leverage other resources we have, which is an alumni network that really has done quite well in continuing its education and has credentials and can participate in those professional and graduate programs as affiliate faculty without, again, having to bring them in, have them become part of campus in a fullest sense. So we're looking at new sets of learners, both regionally and in the types of programs we offer. And we're able to do that by offering online education, though not moving exclusively towards that, but also having a strong commitment to residential liberal arts and sciences education, professional education here. All those things were already being foreseen in the 70s. Framework was set over the last 10 years of making the structural changes we need to, and now being accelerated, the use of technology, as we noted, by COVID. So it's a challenging time for higher education in many ways, especially for institutions that emphasize traditional liberal arts education. But because we've emphasized traditional liberal arts alongside graduate and professional programs, and because we've been flexible, and because we've now have faculty and staff who are more comfortable with online platforms, online education, I think we're well positioned to move forward in these turbulent times.
Thank you, Professor. I can only humbly congratulate you because this is an astonishing outcome in the middle of the worst possible economic and social crisis that we've seen. You and your colleagues have been able to turn around and build on a series of successes, which is essentially what we have seen with many of our interlocutors around the globe. Namely, it is all about frame of mind. You never stopped thinking positively. You and essentially grasped the meaning of advantages that you had, the multiple advantages, and you proceeded accordingly, redefining them to fit these uncertain challenges that we face. I'm sure that the immediate future for 2021 is equally exciting. You mentioned that you're starting the global campus. You are starting the new College of Business, and congratulations on that. That's a wonderful idea. What else have you got? What other positive surprises have you got for the students, the faculty, and the community?
Yeah, so the university structure that we're starting to live into envisions eventually, as things become appropriate, other more autonomous schools opening. We're also have launched a more autonomous school of education. There are considerations regarding engineering and or computer science, which are growing programs at our institution. We're also launching quite soon, or about a year or two out, several other master's programs. As I noted, public administration, and our focus is going to be on public administration, quite broadly defined, really public and nonprofit. So perhaps considering connections regionally to areas of strength here. There are a lot of nonprofits here. So perhaps a certificate in nonprofit leadership. We've pondered a certificate in health leadership. This Grand Rapids is a regional area of health. Also, a lot of global connections, perhaps global nonprofit leadership, perhaps faith-based nonprofit leadership. We're considering also and working towards geographic information science master's degree, public health master's degree. So we're really encouraging our faculty to think carefully about what strengths we have and also what synergies we have that we can utilize. And I keep mentioning this public administration project, and not only because I'm part of it, but because it's really enabled by some of the other seeds that have been planted to take advantage of the public health program that already is further along, to take advantage of our data science and data visualization programs that have been developed, to take advantage of our connections to the city, to the region, also our connections in DC. The meetings that we've been having on that, every time I step back and think, it's incredible now the sorts of synergies that can be brought to bear on this particular program. So that one excites me, but not just for that program, but I think that that's going to unleash another round of creative thinking about not just how do we consider new markets and reaching those markets and new modes of reaching them, but once we start to do that, what new synergies emerge that we can then build on. And that's really exciting. And especially that term synergy is not one that you often hear in the higher education industry. We tend to be much more siloed, autonomous, path dependent, but we're thinking more in those ways, we're building more in those ways, and that's exciting.
Are you thinking about joint degrees with other universities in the US and overseas?
There also has been some conversation about that as well, especially overseas. There are several institutions overseas that have a similar mindset and a similar faith commitment to Calvin that have been interested in starting to explore some of these connections. And so we've been looking in Europe, in Asia, in Africa for those sorts of arrangements. There have been some talks in that way as well. And it will be very interesting to see what emerges from those conversations too. We've had our presidents and provosts traveling, learning from each other. So it's been good too, not just to work as our internal community, to work with our regional community, to work with our alumni community, but also to be seeking out and finding other institutions that are like-minded elsewhere, sort of our piece of the broader higher education community.
I'm recently returned to West Michigan. I spent about 10 years in California until about a year ago. Previous to my leaving, and then having lived here and been raised here, I've been a consumer of a lot of Calvin's offerings. When I was at Michigan State at even James Madison, I used the Calvin library because it was just simply better. Always, every January, really look forward to the January series. And the fact that the brand that Calvin has is really well differentiated from any other institution in Michigan or the region. how much has that helped drive this future innovation and vision for what you are, like the next generation of what you're going to be?
That certainly has helped quite a bit. Thanks for asking that, Corey. It's helped especially to give us confidence to say we can try new things, that there's enough distinctiveness and strength in this brand that it's reasonable to believe we could succeed in new ventures, that we won't just be falling flat because we've gotten too far out, too ahead of ourselves. And one interesting thing that happened as part of this process, specifically as we launched the global campus and started thinking about more online programs, especially online graduate programs, is our president and our provost and our associate provost noted that they had confidence really in our brand. They had confidence in our resources. They had less confidence in our ability to manage all the smaller details of getting into something new. And so they wanted to align with an online platform service to help us out with those things. And so they went out looking for companies that could help us. And what they found really reaffirmed the strength and distinctiveness of the brand, which is there were several different platforms that were really interested in working with Calvin precisely for that reason. And so we've signed an agreement now with Wiley Education to help us with those things. And if ever self-doubts creep in, Wiley has noted specifically that it wants Calvin as part of its portfolio because of that distinctiveness. And so that, I think, was a good explicit external affirmation of that distinctiveness.
Yeah, thank you. So now on the topic of brand a little bit, like so Hunting for Silver Linings is hosted by Startup Grind, Grand Rapids. This Startup Grind, I'm not sure how familiar you are with that organization. We're global. We're 3.5 million members, 600 chapters, 125 countries. Before I started the chapter a year ago, it didn't exist here. My first Startup Grind meeting I had at the Grand Valley campus didn't have but maybe 2 Grand Valley students, but I had a whole table of Calvin students from a startup group where they were, and I was a little surprised to have such a group of students that were like innovation minded. And then in talking with them, they were really impressed with the program. Yeah.
And entrepreneurial, not only innovation minded, but they were entrepreneurs in their own right.
Yeah. And so I was really impressed to even see them sitting there in the first place. Is there some deeper or strong focus towards that in the community at Calvin that that the region doesn't know about, or are we going to build upon that?
There are, I think, 2 kind of cultural drivers to that. One is, as we've noted, Calvin's understanding of the relationship between Christian faith and learning really has been about how do we go out and serve the community, transform the society for the better. And that has showed up in one way, which is related to this, not quite the same way, but I want to mention it, which is a lot of Calvin students and even some faculty have been drawn into public service and politics. And so we have a very strong presence in DC as a way of serving. But we also do attract a lot of students who are quite entrepreneurial, who say, I want to start some sort of venture, whether it's for-profit or non-profit. I want to change the world. I want to make it better. And those sort of swirling currents of the culture were things that attracted me to Calvin. That's a way of students, way students think about themselves, that they have this sense of calling to go out and do something. They want to be well prepared. And so that flows into, I think, an entrepreneurial spirit. And then I think that's strengthened by our number of international students. They are coming here because they know about Calvin through a network of people they know. but they're not coming here simply because they think it sounds like a nice or safe place. They're coming here because they want to be equipped to go out and do something. And I think those two things really swirl together and create a good culture of that. And among other things, the programs Calvin has developed for that, two come to mind immediately. Actually, three come to mind immediately. One is that Calvin has and has had for a few years now an entrepreneurship program, which is designed to be multidisciplinary, to say, all right, entrepreneurship involves understanding a business, but involves more than that in the sense of what does it take to start some sort of new enterprise, new venture, or to innovate within an existing enterprise. What are broad areas of knowledge you need? But also then different outputs, that all entrepreneurship isn't necessarily business entrepreneurship. And so that's designed to be a flexible and multidisciplinary program. There's also Calvin's pitch competition has been growing in popularity and participation each year. So those are the two most visible things I could think of that developed that. The third that came to mind, though, also comes back to where I had originally started to answer this question, is the number of students who are very interested in public service, that similar sort of calling. We have a well-developed semester in Washington, D.C. We have a good network of entities we work with to facilitate internships. And these two things come together. Yet again, I'll mention the Mpa program, which we envision broadly. So building on our School of Business, our Entrepreneurship Program, but also the more political side of things, the more nonprofit side of things, to create really a multifaceted program to help students and others out there, potential students, adult learners, to develop a set of skills in this way.
So I'm going to give you an opportunity to maybe brag and invite like students to look at the university a little deeper here. So ESG is super on trend right now, right? However, it's not a new trend. And Calvin's been really well known for developing strong leaders that do think about community, and you've talked a great deal about that this last hour. With this, it's not a new trend, and Calvin certainly isn't like just arriving to the party. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what it's like or why it's important for students that might not naturally think of a religious experience at a university environment to seriously look at Calvin. And then maybe one of the last questions is going to be, if you could please give some others that are at institutions around in the US and globally trying to affect change, if you can give them a couple pointers as far as maybe starting that change or lighting those fires or blowing on the embers or whatever.
Sure. As far as Calvin, the reason I came to Calvin, I think, is similar to a broader pitch I would make to students. I was raised in the religious tradition, the Reformed tradition that Calvin is part of. But when I went to graduate school, when I left graduate school, I wasn't necessarily looking to become part of a religious institution. I wanted to go to an institution that was located in a vibrant area that emphasized strong liberal arts and sciences undergraduate education, but also wanted faculty who were involved in research in their fields, had professional programs. And when I had opportunity to interview at Calvin, it had all those things, plus it was connected to my own religious tradition, which I thought could be kind of a bonus. But once I arrived to interview, the distinctiveness of the internal culture was pervasive, and not in a sense of everyone thinking the same way or everyone coming from the same background, but rather everyone being drawn with this sense of calling, even if they didn't know what that was, that these were people who really just felt a sense of wanting to learn to work with others, and to make the world better. And that is, it stems from Calvin's religious tradition, but that religious tradition is through and through who Calvin is, but it's a welcome, hospitable, and really supportive sort of tradition. And so I think if this appeals to you as a student, if you really want to go out and change the world for the better, if you want to be part of a community that thinks that way and encourages students to think that way, if you want close connections to faculty and to our alumni, we have very good alumni networks. We have people in many different fields who've appreciated the preparation that they had at Calvin, the sense of calling and purpose that was strengthened through Calvin, that really want to contribute again. And so I think that's really the pitch, to come to Calvin, try our programs, be part of something like that. As far as other institutions wanting to innovate, I've, over the past years, as I've noted, I've been very involved in projects involving kind of systems and structures in place. And I was drawn to that because that's the sort of thinker I am. That's why I was drawn to the social sciences. I like to think about, how do you make systems and structures work and work well? How do you adapt them and change them? How do you make them resistant to the wrong sorts of changes? But what I've really been struck by is the importance, I'm increasingly seeing this, the importance of creating systems in which faculty can innovate and in which there can be this sort of thinking, and along with that, a culture that encourages that and makes it something that is encouraged and incentivized. But the culture and the systems both have to be there. And so in some way too, I think culture is harder to build, harder to change, but systems can contribute to the development of that sort of culture. We now finally have systems in place where faculty can move outside of very narrowly defined roles and tasks and fit into different sorts of programs, different sorts of tasks, and be able to work in those and not run up to the problem of, well, this is the way your role is defined, this is how we fit you in. So you need both. Culture and systems both take time, but they work together, and I think they're both essential.
Cool. It's hard not to make a point of asking about equity. Certainly 2020. Again, this isn't new or unique, especially as a global institution with global reach. Other parts of this world are really struggling with gender equity. Here in the U.S., our topics of equity are a little bit different than elsewhere on the planet. What does Calvin have as far? Do they have a position on this when students or potential faculty or staff are looking at Calvin for like a relationship?
Yes, this is something that Calvin has put a lot of focus into, and like many institutions has also struggled with. Calvin came out of a particular religious tradition, which was ethnically based in the United States. And not only did that, I think, make Calvin a sort of, for quite a while, fairly narrow in its culture and outlook. I think for some people, they wanted it to be a place that would remain narrow, remain closed, remain safe, our place. Everyone wants our place, but that becomes problematic for a lot of reasons, not the least of which really is equity and access. That to the extent that an institution has good things, delivers good things, really is trying to equip leaders for tomorrow, trying to serve communities, it needs to do that by inviting a lot of people in. And some of that was helped along, as I noted, by Calvin's natural connections overseas. We tended to lag a little bit in people from the United States that weren't part of that narrower community. And so here also, especially beginning in the 1980s, Calvin began to focus a lot more on that, and it created a document which is entitled "From Every Nation," and it's based on this vision of the church as calling people together from every nation, and it really has set up a strategy for how do we promote equity and welcoming for students, for faculty, for staff, and those things then have become institutionalized in different ways to continue nudging us forward. And we need to continue to do better. Most institutions really do need to continue to do better, but I'm pleased that we've made this a focus. We've started to create structures and practices to let that happen, to help that to happen. I think it's done best in terms of the staff of the university. It's a bigger challenge in terms of faculty, and that's not just Calvin University, that's the general atmosphere of higher education in the United States. With students, I think it's been mixed, and that too is a challenge for higher education. Costs of higher education, especially for higher cost models. Residential liberal arts colleges tend to be expensive. They have higher cost models. How do you make that more accessible, and how do you do it so without creating tiers of education that some people get the higher value, some people get the lower value? We're trying to find ways to blend these things together to enhance equity. So it's at the front of our minds. We have a foundational document about this. We have structures. We still have a way to go.
Sure. Well, thanks for addressing that. We have a standard last question for all of our guests. Before I get to that, I'm wondering if George has any final thoughts or a last question for you.
So based on what you've been discussing with Corey and innovation and entrepreneurship, if the students that come and do internship with us come up with an idea, where in Calvin do we knock on the door and say, hey, we would like $10,000 for a startup with the student XYZ?
That's a good question. I think a lot of that could be funneled through the business school, through alumni. We're trying to continue to leverage our broader networks, our connections, and we've had alumni who've been very generous in terms of time and talents and financial for the university and for students of various sorts. And for some of that, it's been simply for a student who shows an entrepreneurial spirit to say, I want to get to Calvin. Someone just needs to make up the slack, and that's happened. We also have had some of those alums be caught up by the particular good idea that a student presents and able to make that connection. And I think the two means for helping that connection of ideas and backing probably would come through the business school and through the alumni office.
Well, Professor, allow me to conclude on my side by thanking you. And now that you're part of our community, we will be sending the right students to you, and you can guide them through the university for their entrepreneurial aspirations and for the calling. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
So I'm going to do a little Startup Grind pitch here for you before I get to the super final question, if you can indulge a few more minutes.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. So Startup Grind has university chapters. The requirements to do those, like as a city chapter myself for the Grand Rapids area, I have to hold a certain amount of events, et cetera. It's a lot more flexible on the university side, but the benefits is, of course, the biggest benefit is that students at the university in the chapter get plugged into the international network, right? Obviously, and as George just mentioned, access to a lot of capital and a lot of innovation across the globe. So if there is a professor, if there is a particular student or groups of students that might be interested in starting a university chapter, I'd love to be introduced to them. It's my personal goal in the next 5 years to have a very strong Startup Grind presence in the Great Lakes region, and that includes university chapters. So that's my pitch for Startup Grind. The last question.
I'm just the person in mind for you, Corey. I'll make some connections.
I'm really excited. I'm really excited. Last question that we ask everybody is, what can the global collection of Startup Grind chapter directors, ecosystem builders, innovators, and investors, what can we do for Professor Joel Westra, and what can we do for Calvin? Those are maybe two questions.
There are two questions, and I think they have overlapping answers. I think really helping Calvin, helping me, helping our programs be connected to the things you've just mentioned, be connected to this really innovative and thriving Great Lakes region, and also globally for to bring us students, to help get our name out, to help support our students as they move out from Calvin and into their different callings, their different ideas and pitches and innovations. I think helping to make those sorts of connections that are mutually supporting will help me in my work, help our programs, help Calvin, help students, and facilitate the good work that Startup Grind is doing and looking to continue to do.
Great. Any final words or anything at all?
You know, you and George have asked a great set of questions. I think we've been quite thorough. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I don't think we've left anything significant out in my mind. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah,
thank you so much
for the generosity of your time, and look forward to hearing who I'm going to be liaising with on this this new chapter. So
excellent.
Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
You too.